All right, guys. So yesterday we left off with this year's slide that ultimately brought us to the French Revolution. So we're not going to cover the French Revolution in one day. It is way too much information that you've probably never heard about before. So let's start it out, though. The French Revolution is broken into what they call the three estates of the realm. Right? Those three. Anybody want to take a stab at those? No, because we're not doing this live and it sucks. But the first estate is going to be the royalty, right? The second estate is going to consist of what we'll call, I'm sorry. The first estate is going to be the clergy. The second estate is going to consist of what we call the nobility. So the nobility makes up about 1% to 2% of everything. And it was essentially everyone other than the king who was exempt from a tax, right? And then the clergy is here, and it was about 0.5% of everyone, right? And then there's the third estate. And the third estate is everyone else. It's all the peasants, but it's also the bourgeoisie. So about 8% of these people are actually wealthy, educated people, but they're not nobility and they're not quite the clergy. So when it's broken down, everyone else consists of about 27 million people. Basically, everyone else here, lawyers, merchants, peasants, every other profession, had no special rights at all. The nobility was about 120,000 to 350,000 people, depending on the year. And that consisted of anyone that was considered a lord or a lady, anyone who had sword rights or special law treatment, and was exempt from certain taxes and military service. And then the clergy, which was 130,000-ish people, consisted of basically everyone that worked for the church. So, what is the third estate? This guy. So, written in January in 1789, in response to Jacques Necker's request for how the Estates General should be organized. I'm sorry, I just said Jar instead of Jacques. Jacques comes up with a third estate and essentially decides that that's how he's going to label everyone else. Right? So I'm going to naturally play the fun game of name that estate. Now, this is better whenever you're here participating, but I'm just going to have a dramatic pause for you to take your guess. Yeah, nailed it. The second estate. Good job. I knew you guys could do it. Third estate. Doesn't matter how much money you have, even if you're the wealthiest person on the planet, you still actually only belong to the third estate if you're not royalty. First estate. He's the Pope. Third estate. Have to be the second estate because he's King James, right? But no, it's actually the third estate. The first, the second estate, and if you don't remember, that's Henry VIII. The second estate, and that is going to be King Louis XIV, who is the most gaudy of all kings. As we talked about, he's the one that made the palace at Versailles, and he is going to be the king during this whole reign that we're going to talk about leading up to the French Revolution. So he is the most important one out of all these. Third estate, because now he has no job. That's Dwayne Haskins, by the way, if any of you didn't know. And he just got cut and no one picked him up. He's not good at football. The third estate, peasants. The first estate, because, well, he's still part of the clergy. The second estate, even though they went down and then later on their ship was used in The Little Mermaid, they still count as the second estate because of royalty. The third estate, and stop idolizing Drake. The first estate. The second estate. The third estate. So that's kind of where people end up being put, right? So if that's the case, and Louis has a big financial problem, right, that we just talked about with revolutions and the fact that wars cost money, right? And France just had the 7 Years' War with England, but then also helped out during the Revolutionary War for the colonies. So now France has a massive money problem, right? And in order to make that money back, they need to get it. So how can Louis raise more money? Well, short answer here, go to the Estates General. So the Estates General is the collection of all of the different estates, the first estate, second estate, and third estate. He calls them all together and basically says, we're going to have a conference where I'm going to see what you guys think for how we should get everything essentially back in line and in order. Now, Louis runs the whole conference. He's sitting up there with the arrow pointing to him in the throne, right? And he basically says, we are going to raise taxes and do some cool stuff here to all of you. The first estate, completely cool with it. Clergy doesn't have to pay any taxes. They don't care. Second estate, doesn't have to pay any taxes. They own all the land. They don't care. Third estate, totally pissed off. They're the ones that have to pay all the taxes. Right? So this is last called in 1614, and it was mostly an argued organization. So they essentially all just kind of argued with one another all the time. Each estate got one vote. So all it took was 2 out of 3 to get your way that you wanted. The king locks them out of their meeting room, though, and says, nope, third estate, guess what? You guys can just go away. First and second estate, we're going to actually negotiate things. So because of that, the third estate literally goes next door into what they call, and formed what they called the tennis court oath. So they literally went into an indoor tennis court, right? And all of the members of the Estates General that were part of the third estate swore an oath. It's technically a handball court, but whatever. Many nobles essentially also kind of were invited here, but 576 out of the 577 estates, third estate members actually agreed to this oath, plus 2 nobles and 1 of the clergy. So little small snippet there. It was the first formal stand against Louis. And it was the first time that the third estate said, it doesn't matter what you guys vote for. We're 98% of the population. We are going to make our own rules. And so thus leads this guy, Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre is the guy who essentially takes command of the third estate and becomes the voice for all of the peasants, essentially. The National Assembly, considering that it has been called to establish the constitution of the realm, to bring about the regeneration of public order, and to maintain the true principles of monarchy, nothing may prevent it from continuing its deliberations in any place it is forced to establish itself. And finally, the National Assembly exists wherever its members are gathered, decrees that all members of his assembly immediately take an oath never to separate, and to reassemble whenever circumstances require, until the constitution of the realm is established and fixed upon the solid foundations, and that said oath having been sworn, all members and each one individually confirm this unwavering resolution with his signature. So what that's essentially saying is, everyone that was here made this oath, right? They all signed this piece of paper saying that they were going to form what they called the National Assembly. They didn't care about the Estates General anymore. They don't care what the king has to say. They don't care what the clergy has to say. They are doing their own thing now. They are going to form their own party. They're going to form their own government with their own new constitution. So that was the oath. So sides are set, and where does the revolution begin? The Bastille. So the Third Estate essentially needs to kind of find a way to put up a fight against the First and Second Estate. First and Second Estate control almost all the money, so there is that, right? So the Bastille is this building right in the center of Paris. It was built to defend Paris during the 100 Years' War in 1357. So it is this old castle that essentially had been kind of decrepit on part of it and was being rebuilt by Louis as a way to kind of demonstrate power. It was a symbol of monarchical despot oppression. So literally, he would use it as a massive prison fort in the middle of the city, so that way they could show off essentially all of the prisoners and anyone who went against what Louis had to say. Well, on July 14th, 1789, the Third Estate needs gunpowder, so they storm the Bastille. Whenever they do this, they all line up. They show up with picks, with rakes, with axes, with scythes, with swords and spears. And they don't really have very many guns, but what they do have are numbers. So they storm all the walls of the Bastille in an effort to try and get as many weapons as they can. And when they do, they come across the Royal Armory, which is literally all of the gunpowder that France had in its possession. The death toll ended up being about 98 rioters and 2 guards, which is remarkably low considering how many people were involved in this. There end up being about 7 prisoners free, and they tear down the entire bridge that connects the Bastille to the actual starting point of the city. So, remember what they all promised to do on that oath? They all said that they would rejoin together when called upon, right? So, it passed 2 months after the tennis court oath. They came up with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Whenever they did this, they essentially put all of their oath that they had originally into a preamble and into a real constitution. So all of those thoughts of saying, hey, when we get a constitution together, we're going to need you all to back us up. Well, now that they have this constitution put together, they're calling all their people in. It was written by Lafayette and Jefferson. So if you were wondering where Jefferson went after the Revolutionary War, this is where he was. If you've ever seen the movie or play Hamilton, whenever Jefferson literally comes home, this is what he was doing. He was helping start the French Revolution with Lafayette. So within the Declaration of Rights of Man, they said men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural rights of the man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The principle of all sovereignty resides in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. No person shall be accused, arrested, or imprisoned except in cases and according to the forms prescribed by law. The law shall provide for such punishments only as are strictly and obviously necessary, and no one shall suffer punishment except be it legally inflicted in virtue of a law passed. As all persons are held innocent until they shall have been declared guilty, no one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. The security of the rights of man, the citizen requires public military forces. These forces are, therefore, established for the good of all, and not for the personal advantage of those whom shall be entrusted. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's essentially just the next step from what our Constitution was. And Jefferson is the main person behind the writing of this. And since he wrote most of the Declaration of Independence and most of the Constitution, it makes sense that it sounds very familiar, right? But all of this builds up and leads to a massive, massive fight. Spending bread prices go up 10 times. The spending, people were spending 50% of their wages on bread. And they essentially thought that there was a famine pact, that the government was hiding bread. Royalists come in, moving capital. Word reached that royalists might move capital to Tours, which was a city 150 miles away from Paris, and that the king might not like this declaration of rights. So in the royal banquet on October 1st in 1789, they show up and storm the royal banquet. And when the Third Estate storms the royal banquet, it doesn't go well. The king moves his residence to Paris. He leaves the palace at Versailles, and he essentially never goes back because, well, the Jacobins come in. So the Jacobins were the Society of Friends of the Constitution. They met at the Jacobin Club. So there it is. It had over 500,000 members. They wanted a republic and knew they would not be accepted by the monarchist neighbors that they had. So they wanted to have a war with them. The Mountain was considered the most radical faction of them, and they were led by Robespierre, the guy that I brought up before. Now, Robespierre is the guy who's leading the Third Estate, and he is essentially the most radical of all of these groups. And whenever he kind of takes over, he's very much on the progressive ultra-left, and is extremely violent. So he takes the fight all the way to Varennes. The king and his family tried to flee to join loyalist troops, but doesn't work for them. They end up getting caught, and whenever they get caught, he ends up getting captured and then led to the abolishment of the monarchy, and they eliminated the king's role. They charged him with treason for going against his own people, and they brought him into the guillotine, or the national resort. It was proposed by the National Assembly in 1789 by Joseph Guillotine, and it essentially was made to make everyone equal in death. It was used all the way until 1977, and its famous victims were all there. So Louis gets arrested, put on trial, found guilty of high treason, and is executed on August 10th. His last speech pardoned those who are the cause of my death, and he was buried in an unmarked grave. His head was buried between his legs, and Marie Antoinette, his wife, was eventually also executed on October 16th.
Well, don't take it too hard. You're not the first person to get fired.
Look, Louis, the French people really want to thank you for your services as king, but it's just not working out, and we've decided to go another way. So, yeah.
And on that, we'll pick up with the rest of the revolution tomorrow. And I hope you guys have a great day.